In the merciless heat of the Texas badlands, three desperate men are about to make a fatal mistake. Fresh from a bloody prison break that left two guards dead, they think they've found an easy target, a young woman riding alone through Mason County. They don't know that Sarah McKenna was raised by the most feared gunfighter Texas has ever known. James "Deadeye" McKenna hasn't drawn his guns in 5 years. Not since he put down the notorious Collins gang in a shootout that left 7 men dead in 7 seconds. He's tried to leave that life behind, tried to be just another rancher raising his daughter in peace. But when these escaped killers take his girl, they're about to learn why even hardened outlaws still wake up screaming at the memory of McKenna's revolvers. This isn't just a story about revenge. This is about how 3 desperate men learned that some legends don't fade. They just wait for a reason to show why their reputation was earned in blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted long shadows across the McKenna ranch as Sarah worked with her horse in the practice ring. At 19, she moved with the same fluid grace her father had shown in gunfights, though she was practicing cutting cattle, not drawing iron. Her dark hair was tied back tight, her movements precise and controlled as she guided her mount through complex patterns. James McKenna watched from the fence, his weathered face revealing both pride and concern. His gun belt hung in his study now, the matched Colts that had made him legendary, gathering dust for the past 5 years. But old habits died hard. His eyes still scanned the horizon regularly, checking approaches and angles just as he had when every shadow might have hidden an assassin's rifle. "Your horse is favoring his left side," he called out, his voice carrying the gravelly authority that once commanded respect in every saloon from El Paso to Amarillo. "Correct his stance before he develops bad habits." Sarah adjusted her position without looking up. "Like you corrected yours, Dad. Marshal Wilson says you used to favor your right draw until that business in Laredo." McKenna's face tightened. He'd tried to keep his past away from his daughter, but in a place like Mason County, legends had a way of surviving. Every old-timer in every bar had a story about Deadeye McKenna, the man who could put 2 bullets through the same hole at 50 paces, the man who'd cleaned out the worst elements of Texas, one smoking gun at a time. "Marshal Wilson talks too much," he said finally. "Those days are done." Sarah brought her horse to a stop, fixing her father with a knowing look. She had her mother's eyes, but McKenna's intensity. "Are they? Is that why you still check the windows every night? Why you made sure I could shoot before I could ride?" McKenna walked over to adjust her stirrup, buying time to frame his response. The truth was, he'd tried to give Sarah a normal life, but his instincts wouldn't let him leave her defenseless. By 12, she could outshoot most men. By 15, she could handle herself in any situation. He'd taught her everything, except why he felt it was so necessary. "The world's a dangerous place," he said finally. "Knowing how to handle yourself isn't the same as looking for trouble, like that trouble you handled 5 years ago. The Collins gang?" McKenna's hand unconsciously touched his side, where Billy Collins' bullet had creased him before he'd put the gang down. 7 men, 7 seconds. The newspapers had made it sound like poetry. They hadn't mentioned the nightmares, the way he still woke up some nights hearing the echo of gunshots. "That trouble found me," he said quietly. "I didn't go looking for it." Sarah dismounted, leading her horse to the water trough. "Maybe, but you were ready when it came, like you're making sure I'll be ready." McKenna watched his daughter, seeing both the child he'd raised and the woman she was becoming. She was right. He'd trained her like he was preparing for war, all while pretending they were just a normal ranching family. But the weight of his past hung over them like storm clouds on the horizon. The ranch hands were starting their morning duties, the familiar sounds of cattle and horses filling the air. It was peaceful here most days, McKenna had chosen this spot carefully. Clear lines of sight in all directions, multiple escape routes, defensible positions, old habits wrapped in new purposes. "I'm riding into town later," Sarah said, breaking into his thoughts. "We need supplies, and I promised Mrs. Henderson I'd help with the church social planning." McKenna nodded, ignoring the familiar twist of anxiety in his gut. "Be back before dark." "And Sarah?" She turned, knowing what was coming. "Keep your eyes open. Always do, Dad. You taught me well." As she led her horse to the barn, McKenna gazed across his land. 5 years of peace had been a blessing. He'd built something here, something honest and good, but in his heart he knew Sarah was right. He wasn't preparing her for ranch life. He was preparing her for the day his past caught up with them. He just prayed he was wrong about how soon that day might come. Marshal Tom Wilson's office in Mason County wasn't much to look at, but it had a clear view of the street and sturdy walls that had stopped more than one bullet. He was studying a telegram when McKenna walked in, and the marshal's grim expression told its own story. "Bad news travels fast," Wilson said, pushing the telegram across his desk. "Huntsville prison. 3 escapees last night, 2 guards dead." McKenna picked up the paper, his face hardening as he read the names. Victor Reyes, Michael Blackwood, Tom Hawkins. Each name carried weight, each one tied to his past. "The Laredo job." Wilson nodded, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass. 8 years ago. You put them away after they tried to rob the railway office. 15 dead in the crossfire before you ended it." "I remember." McKenna's voice was flat. The shootout had lasted less than 2 minutes, but he remembered every second. Reyes had been the planner, Blackwood the killer, and Hawkins. Hawkins had been the worst of them, the one who enjoyed his work too much. "They killed 2 guards during the escape," Wilson continued. "Made it look personal, beat them to death instead of just shooting them." He slid the whiskey toward McKenna. "Thought you should know they were heard talking about Mason County before they broke out." McKenna left the whiskey untouched. "They're coming here?" "Probably. You've got enemies, James. Most of them are dead or in prison, but these 3... Wilson leaned forward. "They had 8 years to plan this, to feed their hate." Through the window, McKenna could see ordinary people going about their day. A woman buying groceries, children playing, Sarah leading her horse to the general store. All that peace he'd built, all that normalcy, suddenly felt like a dream about to shatter. "There's more," Wilson said quietly. "Hawkins has family in the area. That cousin of his, Jake, still runs that old ranch north of here. Could be providing support." McKenna remembered Jake Hawkins, a coward who'd never gotten his own hands dirty, but was always happy to help others do their killing. The kind of man who'd shelter fugitives while pretending to be a respectable rancher. How far behind them are the prison pursuers? Wilson shook his head. "Lost the trail near the river. These men, they're not running scared. They're moving with purpose." He studied his old friend. "Your guns still quick, James?" McKenna's hands remained steady on the telegram. "Quick enough. Might need to be. Reports say they've gotten meaner in prison, if that's possible. Reyes runs a gang inside. Protection rackets, smuggling. Blackwood killed 3 inmates, all made to look like accidents. And Hawkins." Wilson's voice trailed off. "What about Hawkins?" "He's changed. Guards say he spent most of his time reading strategy books, military history. One guard reported hearing him talk about some ancient Chinese general, Sun Tzu, said, 'Revenge is a dish best served with patience and planning.'" McKenna stood, moving to the window. Sarah was finishing her shopping, chatting with Mrs. Henderson. She looked so much like her mother in that moment, so innocent of the violence about to touch their lives. "I need to get her out of here," he said quietly. "Send her to her aunt in Austin." Wilson shook his head. "You really think she'd go? That girl's got your stubborn streak, James. Besides, running might be exactly what they're counting on. Easier to hit a moving target sometimes." McKenna knew he was right. Sarah wouldn't leave, and moving might make them more vulnerable. Better to face what was coming on ground he knew, ground he'd chosen and prepared for exactly this kind of situation. "I'll send word to the Rangers," Wilson offered. "Get some extra men out here." "No." McKenna's response was immediate. "More men means more targets, more confusion. These three, they're not coming for a stand-up fight. They're coming for revenge. They'll want it personal." A commotion outside drew their attention. A rider was coming in fast, horse lathered and heaving. One of Wilson's deputies returning from patrol. "Marshal," the young deputy nearly fell getting off his horse. "Found something out by Chalk Creek. Campsite, less than a day old. 3 men. He caught his breath. "Found this too." He held up. "A bloody prison guard's badge." Wilson and McKenna shared a look. The deputy continued. "Tracks headed east toward Jake Hawkins' place." "How far?" McKenna asked. "Based on the campsite. They could be there by now." McKenna moved toward the door, his walk already different. Wilson recognized it. The gunfighter's glide, smooth and balanced, ready for anything. "James," Wilson called after him, "they'll be watching your place, watching Sarah." "I know." McKenna paused in the doorway. "That's exactly what I'm counting on. But first I need to have a talk with Jake Hawkins. Want company?" McKenna shook his head. "Better alone. Jake spooks easy. Besides," his hand unconsciously touched where his gun belt should be, "got to go home first. Got some old friends to reunite with." As McKenna mounted up, Wilson watched him ride out. The peaceful rancher was gone. In his place was the man Wilson remembered from 8 years ago, the man they called Deadeye, the most dangerous gunfighter in Texas, and God help anyone who threatened his daughter. Sarah McKenna knew something was wrong 3 miles outside of town. The birds had gone quiet, and her horse's ears were twitching nervously. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Nature speaks plain enough, if you've got the sense to listen." She adjusted her position in the saddle, casually letting her hand drift closer to the small revolver hidden in her skirt pocket. Another of her father's lessons, always be armed, but never let them see you're armed. The ambush came at the creek crossing, exactly where she would have set it up herself. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, spread out to cut off escape. Roots, professional work, not common bandits. These men moved with purpose. "Well, what do we have here?" The speaker was lean and weather-beaten, with eyes like empty wells. "Miss McKenna, I believe?" Victor Reyes smiled, but it never reached those dead eyes. Sarah kept her voice steady. "You seem to have me at a disadvantage, mister." The second man laughed, a harsh sound. "Oh, your daddy never mentioned us. I'm hurt." Michael Blackwood touched. The scar on his face, a souvenir from James McKenna's gun, though I suppose he had his reasons for keeping quiet. The third man, Tom Hawkins, hadn't spoken yet. He just watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She recognized him now from wanted posters, but the pictures hadn't captured the coiled violence in his stance. "Your father home, girl?" Reyes asked casually, as if discussing the weather. "Why don't you ride up and find out?" Sarah's mind was racing, calculating odds. 3 guns on her, but they were spread out. If she could get to the creek bed. "Spirited," Hawkins spoke finally, his voice surprisingly soft. "Just like," they said. "This is perfect." He moved his horse closer. "You know, we spent 8 years planning this. Had it all worked out. But then Jake mentioned you and, well," he smiled. "Plans can improve." Sarah saw his hand twitch toward his gun and made her move. She didn't draw her revolver. Instead, she yanked her horse's reins hard left while throwing herself right into the creek bed. Her father's voice again. "Sometimes the best draw is no draw at all." Gunshots cracked above her as she rolled behind a boulder. They were good, but they'd expected a helpless girl, not someone trained by Deadeye McKenna himself. She had her revolver out now, waiting. "Impressive," Hawkins called out. "Definitely your father's daughter. But here's the thing. Miss McKenna, She heard horses splashing through the creek, surrounding her position. "We were hoping you'd run." Something heavy hit her from behind. Jake Hawkins, the cousin, had been waiting in the creek bed. She managed one shot, catching him in the shoulder, before the others were on her. The fight was brief but violent. Sarah broke Blackwood's nose and nearly took Reyes's eye before they subdued her. When it was over, Tom Hawkins looked at her with something like admiration. "You know," he said, binding her hands, "most folks would have just surrendered." "Probably. Would have been easier on them." He examined a deep bite mark on his arm. "But you fought like you knew exactly what we were. I know what my father does to men like you." Sarah spat blood from a split lip. "And I know what he'll do when he finds you." Hawkins smiled. "Finds us? Oh no, Miss McKenna. Your father's not going to find us." He mounted up, pulling her onto his horse. "We're going to tell him exactly where we are. That's the whole point. Jake," he called to his cousin, who was still cursing over his wounded shoulder, "ride into town. Tell Deadeye his girl's at the old Gonzalez ranch. Tell him she'll stay alive as long as he comes alone." Reyes looked uncertain. "That wasn't the plan, Tom. We were supposed to—" "Plans change," Hawkins cut him off. 8 years I studied military strategy in that cell. Know what I learned? The best way to defeat a superior fighter isn't to match his strength. He patted, the rifle strapped to his saddle. It's to change the battlefield entirely. Sarah felt her blood run cold. They weren't just trying to kill her father, they were trying to break him first. "Your daddy's reputation," Hawkins continued, steering his horse north. "It's not built on speed, though he's plenty fast. It's not built on accuracy, though they call him Deadeye for a reason. It's built on control. Perfect, absolute control." He looked down at her. "Let's see how well he controls himself when he's watching his daughter bleed." As they rode away, Sarah left her 4th hair ribbon tangled in a creek branch. Her father had taught her to mark trails too, after all. And these men, for all their planning, had made one crucial mistake. They thought they were using her to get to him. They didn't realize they'd just given him a reason to become what he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. The most dangerous gunfighter in Texas wasn't the man who'd put them in prison. It was the father they'd just made desperate. James McKenna was cleaning his old Colts when Jake Hawkins rode into town. He'd known something was wrong when Sarah's horse came back riderless, trailing a cut rein. By the time Marshal Wilson brought word of Jake's arrival, the legendary matched. Revolvers were already loaded and holstered. The transformation was complete. Gone was the peaceful rancher, replaced by something that made hardened men step back. McKenna moved through town like a storm front, his spurs ringing with deadly purpose on the wooden sidewalk. Jake Hawkins was propped up in Wilson's office, a bloody bandage on his shoulder. His smug expression faltered when McKenna entered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "She put up quite a fight," Jake managed, trying to sound brave. "That's quite a girl you—" McKenna's hand moved faster than anyone could follow. He caught Jake by the throat, lifting him one-handed against the wall. "Location." His voice was soft, terrible in its quietness. "Tom says to tell you she's at the Gonzalez ranch," Jake choked out. "Says to come alone or—" "Your cousin always did talk too much." McKenna's grip tightened slightly. "Now tell me what he didn't say to tell me." Marshal Wilson watched from his desk, making no move to intervene. He'd seen this side of McKenna before, the cold calculation behind the violence. Every move had purpose. I don't know what you mean," Jake gasped. 8 years in prison. Tom studied strategy, didn't he? Planned this out?" McKenna's eyes were winter cold. "The Gonzalez ranch is too obvious. It's a trap. Where's he really taking her?" Jake's eyes widened. Whether from fear or lack of air, he started talking. The old mission, south of Gonzalez. Tom said something about high ground and clear fields of fire. McKenna released him. Jake slumped, coughing. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" "You don't understand," Jake wheezed. Tom's not the same man you knew. He's planned for everything. He's got rifles posted. Let me explain something. McKenna cut him off. Your cousin spent 8 years studying strategy. I spent 20 years living it. He checked his gun belt with practiced efficiency. Every move, every position he's thought. I've already seen it done better by better men. Wilson stood up. James, let me send for the Rangers. We can... No. McKenna's tone brooked no argument. They're watching the roads. Any large group approaches, Sarah dies. He turned back to Jake. How many men besides the 3 of them? 4. 4 more at the mission. Hired guns. Jake touched his bruised throat. Tom said to tell you to come alone. And I will. McKenna moved to the door, then paused. One more thing, that shoulder wound, Sarah's work? Jake nodded reluctantly. Good girl. McKenna's smile was cold. Marshall, lock him up. If anything happens to Sarah, he'll be the first one I come back for. Outside, the town had gone quiet. Everyone knew that look, remembered the stories. Dead-Eye McKenna was back. In the livery stable, McKenna prepared methodically. Extra ammunition, water, basic medical supplies, a rifle in addition to his revolvers. Everything checked and double-checked with mechanical precision. You're really going alone? Wilson asked from the doorway. They'll be watching all approaches, McKenna replied, adjusting his saddle. 7 men, probably split between the Gonzales, ranch and the mission. Tom's clever but predictable. He'll want to prove something. That's what worries me. Man studies war for 8 years. He's bound to have some tricks. McKenna mounted up, checking the sun's position. Know what his mistake was? All that reading about strategy, about warfare. He pulled on his black gloves, supple leather that wouldn't interfere with his trigger pull. This isn't war. This is personal. They'll be expecting you to come in angry, make mistakes. I know. McKenna turned his horse toward the south road. That's why I'm not angry. Anger makes you stupid, gets you killed. His voice was emotionless, mechanical. I'm going to get my daughter back. Anyone who stands in my way is just a target. Wilson recognized that tone. It was the same one from the Laredo shootout, when McKenna had taken down 15 men without raising his voice or breaking a sweat. James, Wilson called after him. What they did, taking Sarah, they crossed a line. McKenna didn't look back. Yes, they did, and now they're going to learn why some lines should never be crossed. As he rode out of town, people watched from windows and doorways. They'd heard the stories, but few had ever seen Deadeye McKenna in action. Now they understood why his reputation had spread across Texas like wildfire. This wasn't just a father going to rescue his daughter. This was a legend coming out of retirement, and God help anyone who stood in his way. McKenna spotted the first sign within an hour. Sarah's hair ribbon caught in the creek branches. His girl was leaving him a trail, just like he'd taught her. Pride mixed with cold determination as he catalogued details. Broken twigs showing direction. A carefully placed stone indicating numbers. She wasn't just marking her path. She was giving him tactical information. That's my girl, he muttered, urging his horse forward. Hold on, Sarah. I'm coming. And in his mind, he was already counting. Bullets, calculating angles, planning how 7 men would die before sunset. The old mission's stone walls held the heat like an oven, but Sarah McKenna kept her mind cool and clear. Her father's voice guided her thoughts. In any bad situation, first thing you do is assess. Count weapons. Mark exits. Find advantages. From her position tied to a wooden chair in the mission's main room, she could see 4 hired guns, plus her 3 captors. 7 men total, just like she'd indicated to her father using carefully placed stones along their trail. Each stone had been a risk, each marker a calculated move, while pretending to stumble or need a rest stop. Tom Hawkins paced the room, checking windows with military precision. His men had rifles posted at 3 positions: bell tower, south wall, and the old stable. Clear fields of fire, just as he'd planned. But Sarah had noticed something he hadn't. The afternoon sun would blind his western shooters. "Your father should be getting our message about now," Hawkins said, stopping in front of her. "Assuming your Uncle Jake managed to deliver it without dying, I shot him," Sarah replied calmly. "But not fatally. Unlike some people, I don't kill without reason." Blackwood laughed from his position by the door. "Hear that, Tom? Girl thinks she's got her daddy's moral code. What I've got," Sarah met his eyes, "is his aim. Want to see the hole I left in Jake's shoulder? Clean through, just like Dad taught me." She saw the flicker of uncertainty in Blackwood's face. "Good. Plant the seeds of doubt. Make them wonder what else she might have learned from Deadeye McKenna." Reyes returned from his perimeter check, looking uneasy. "Tom, we should move her to the Gonzalez ranch like planned. This place, it's too exposed." "The ranch is too obvious," Hawkins snapped. "McKenna would expect that. Here, we control the high ground. Here we can see him coming from any direction. Unless," Sarah said quietly, "that's exactly what he wants you to think." Hawkins turned to her sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just that Dad always said the most dangerous position is the one where you think you're safe." She shrugged, letting the rope binding her wrists loosen slightly. "Another lesson. Always keep them talking while working on escape." "Your father's good," Hawkins admitted, "but he's not Ghost. He can't hit what he can't see, and from any approach we'll spot him half a mile out." One of the hired guns, a twitchy man Sarah had mentally named Nervous, spoke up. "Boss, girls, got a point. McKenna's reputation..." "Reputation," Hawkins cut him off. "I spent 8 years studying every shootout, every tactic he ever used. I know how he thinks." "No." Sarah's voice was soft but carried across the room. "You know how he used to think, before someone was stupid enough to take his daughter." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Sarah saw Reyes and Blackwood exchange glances. Even the hired guns shifted uncomfortably. Only Hawkins seemed unmoved, but she noticed his hand tighten on his rifle. "You trying to scare my men, girl?" His voice was dangerous. "Just having a conversation about history, like that Laredo shootout, where Dad put you away." She looked at each man in turn. 15 dead in under 2 minutes, wasn't it? And that was just business. This, she smiled her father's cold smile. "This is family." "Shut her up, Tom," Blackwood growled. "She's playing with our heads." "Like Dad played with yours in Laredo?" Sarah pressed. "How's that scar healing, Mr. Blackwood? The one where his first shot took your gun hand before you could even clear leather?" Blackwood's hand moved to his pistol, but Hawkins stopped him. "She's trying to provoke us, wanting us to make mistakes." He studied Sarah with newfound respect. "Your father taught you more than just shooting, didn't he? He taught me that men who spend 8 years planning revenge usually die quicker than men who don't see it coming at all." A shot rang out from the bell tower. Everyone tensed, but it was just one of the hired guns shooting at a coyote. Still, Sarah noted how they all jumped. Their nerves were showing. "Sun's getting low," Reyes observed. "He'll come soon." "Let him come," Hawkins said, but Sarah heard the strain in his voice. "Everything's planned, every angle covered, almost every..." "Angle," Sarah said. When Hawkins looked at her questioningly, she nodded toward the western windows. "Might want to reposition your men before sunset, unless you want them staring blind into the sun when Dad arrives." Hawkins cursed softly, realizing she was right. As he moved to adjust his defenses, Sarah worked the ropes a little looser. They'd tied her well, but not well enough. They'd made the same mistake everyone made, underestimating what James McKenna might have taught his daughter. She watched the sun sink lower, counting minutes, marking positions. The hired guns were getting jumpy, casting frequent glances at the surrounding landscape. They'd come expecting easy money. Now they were starting to realize they were just targets in someone else's revenge. "You know what your real mistake was?" she asked Hawkins when he returned. "Not the tactical errors, not even taking me. She leaned forward slightly. Your mistake was giving him time to think. Dad always said a gunfight is won in the mind before the first shot's fired. And what's your father thinking now? Hawkins demanded. Sarah looked at the setting sun, calculating angles just as she'd been taught. He's thinking that in about 20 minutes, that sun will be right in your Western shooter's eyes. He's thinking your hired guns are nervous, your planning has holes, and your revenge has given him something worth killing for. She met Hawkins' gaze. But mostly, he's thinking about how 7 men are about to die, and he's already decided. The order. The room fell silent except for nervous checking his rifle action repeatedly. Sarah settled back, feeling the ropes nearly loose enough. Her father would come soon, and when he did, she intended to be ready. After all, Deadeye McKenna hadn't just taught his daughter how to shoot. He'd taught her how to win. McKenna approached the mission like a ghost, his years of experience making him one with the lengthening shadows. Half a mile out, he left his horse in a dry creek bed and continued on foot. Through his rifle scope, he counted positions, noting each man's placement with cold precision. 7 men, he whispered to himself, 3 in elevated positions, 2 at ground level, 2 inside with Sarah. His mind calculated angles, distances, firing lines. The sun was low, painting the western sky in blood red. Perfect. The first man died so quietly his partners never noticed. McKenna ghosted up behind. The nervous-looking hired gun, watching the eastern approach, wrapped an arm around his throat and let him slide silently to the ground. 1 down. 6 to go. Check in, Martinez. A voice crackled over the dead man's radio. McKenna picked up the radio, perfectly mimicking the unconscious man's nervous tenor. All clear on the east side. He'd learned long ago that imitation was a useful skill in his line of work. Through his scope, he watched Hawkins directing men in the bell tower to new positions. The sun was becoming a problem for them, just as Sarah's trail markers had suggested it would be. His daughter had read the terrain perfectly, leaving him signs that told a story beyond just direction. You taught her well, Tom, McKenna muttered, moving like smoke through the lengthening shadows. But you forgot who taught me. The second man fell to a precisely thrown knife as he rounded the corner of the mission wall. No sound, no warning. Just the quiet thud of a body hitting dirt. 2 down, 5 to go. In the bell tower, one of the hired guns was getting nervous. Something's wrong, he said into his radio. Martinez isn't responding to visual signals. Check on him, Hawkins ordered, his voice tight with tension. That's right, McKenna whispered, settling into position. Send another one out. He'd learned in Laredo that men like Hawkins couldn't help overthinking, over-planning. They'd studied warfare, but never understood that sometimes the simplest solution was the deadliest. The third man died from a single silenced rifle shot as he went to check on his missing companions. 3 down, 4 to go. Inside the mission, he could hear voices arguing. His enhanced scope showed him Sarah, still working on her ropes while keeping their attention with talk. Pride mixed with cold focus. She wasn't just surviving, she was playing her part in the hunt. Missing 3 men now. Reyes's voice carried through a broken window. Tom, this isn't right. He's picking us off. Shut up, Hawkins shouted. Hold your positions. He has to come through one of our fields of fire. Has to. McKenna smiled grimly. Another lesson these men had never learned. You don't have to go through a field of fire if you can make your enemies come to you. He pulled out an old trick from his ranger days, a small mirror and his spare revolver. Catching the setting sun just right, he fired the revolver into the ground while flashing the mirror from a different position. The effect was instant. Shot fired, north side, someone yelled. Muzzle flash from behind the old well. Mitchell Jones, check it out, Hawkins ordered. 2 men moved toward the well, weapons ready. They were professionals, moving with proper tactical spacing, but they were looking in the wrong direction, drawn by McKenna's simple deception. The key ace. Fourth man fell to a headshot from McKenna's position east of their focus. Before his partner could turn, the fifth man joined him. 5 down, 2 to go. Now there was only Hawkins and Reyes inside with Sarah. McKenna could hear panic creeping into their voices. "It's just us now," Hawkins was saying, "but we still have the girl. We still control this." Control. Reyes sounded close to breaking. "He just killed 5 men, and we never even saw him. This isn't control. This is a slaughter." McKenna moved to the mission's back wall, where crumbling stone offered handholds. As he climbed silently, he heard Sarah's voice drift through the window. "I tried to warn you," she was saying calmly. "Dad doesn't do fair fights, never has." "Shut up," Hawkins shouted. "You hear me, McKenna. Show yourself, or she dies." McKenna reached the window just in time to see Hawkins press a gun to Sarah's head. Reyes was by the door, his weapon darting between windows. "You know what your real mistake was, Tom," McKenna called out, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You spent 8 years studying how I kill. Should have spent more time studying why I kill. Show yourself." Hawkins was turning in circles now, his composure cracking. "You wanted the legendary Deadeye McKenna." McKenna's voice shifted position again. "Well, congratulations, you've got him. Last time in Laredo it was just business. This time," he let the silence stretch, "this time you made it personal." Sarah caught her father's eye through the window, gave an almost imperceptible nod. Her hands were free, though she maintained the illusion of being bound, like father, like daughter, both of them counting down to the moment when preparation met. Opportunity, and in the dying light of a Texas sunset, that moment had finally come. The mission's main room had become a trap, but not the one Hawkins had planned. As the last rays of sunlight painted the walls blood red, Sarah watched her captors unravel. Her father's psychological warfare had done its work. Now it was her. "Turn to spring the trap. 5 men dead," she said quietly, watching Hawkins' pace. "That's got to be eating at you, Tom. All that planning, all that strategy, and he's just ghosting through it like smoke." "Shut up." Hawkins pressed his gun harder against her temple. "Your father's good, I'll give him that. But one wrong move." And what?" Sarah's voice carried the same deadly calm as her father's. "You'll kill me? Then what leverage do you have?" Reyes was falling apart by the door, his gun hand shaking. "Tom, we need to go. Now, while we still can." "Nobody's going anywhere," Hawkins snarled. "McKenna, last chance. Show yourself or you'll prove me right." McKenna's voice drifted through different windows, impossible to pin down. "Prove that you're just another man who mistakes cruelty for strength?" Sarah felt Hawkins's gun hand trembling slightly. Perfect. Just like her father had taught her. Fear makes men stupid, makes them forget to watch the little things, like the fact that her hands were now completely free. "You know what I learned in prison, McKenna?" Hawkins shouted at the shadows. "I learned that even legends can bleed, can die, can watch everything they love torn away." "And you know what I learned as a father?" McKenna's voice was closer now. "That some men deserve to die slow." Sarah saw her opening. Hawkins had shifted his weight, turning to track her father's voice. His gun was still against her head, but his grip had loosened just enough. She moved like lightning, just as she'd practiced hundreds of times. Her elbow struck Hawkins's wrist at the exact angle to numb his grip. As the gun wavered, she dropped and rolled, sweeping his legs while grabbing for his fallen weapon. Reyes opened fire at the windows, spraying bullets wildly. But McKenna had already moved, and the muzzle flashes only served to ruin what was left of Reyes's night vision. "Tom!" Reyes screamed. "She's loose!" Hawkins scrambled for his backup gun, but Sarah was already behind an overturned table, Hawkins's own revolver trained on him. "Might want to reconsider," she said calmly. "Dad made sure I could shoot before I could ride, remember?" "Quite a girl you've got there, Tom." McKenna's voice came from the doorway. Both men spun to face it, but he was already gone. Takes after. Her old man, don't you think? Reyes broke first. He made a dash for the side door, panic overwhelming training. He made it 2 steps before McKenna's shot took him through the shoulder, spinning him to the floor. That's for putting hands on my daughter. McKenna's voice was ice cold. The kill shot still coming. Hawkins was backed against the wall now, trying to cover both Sarah and the windows. His careful strategy had dissolved into desperate survival. 8 years, he screamed. 8 years I planned this, studied every move you'd make. Then you should have studied harder, Sarah said, her gun never wavering. Because Dad always says, the fight's over before the first shot, McKenna finished, finally stepping into view behind Hawkins. If you know what your enemy will do, Hawkins spun, raising his gun, but McKenna was faster. 2 shots rang out as one. McKenna's taking Hawkins's gun hand, Sarah's catching him in the leg. The strategist collapsed, his brilliant plan ending in pain and failure. You see, Tom? McKenna stepped closer, his Colt trained on Hawkins's head. While you were studying strategy, I was teaching my daughter how to survive men like you. While you were planning revenge, I was planning for every threat that might come for her. Might want to check on Reyes, Dad, Sarah called out, keeping her gun on Hawkins. He's looking a bit pale. In a minute, baby. McKenna's eyes never left. Hawkins, Tom and I need to have a final conversation about respect, about lines that don't get crossed. Hawkins looked up at them, father and daughter, matching cold expressions, guns trained with identical precision. You taught her everything, didn't you? Made her just as deadly as you? No, Sarah answered before her father could. He taught me to be smarter than men like you. The deadly part. She smiled her father's smile. That just runs in the family, Reyes moaned from his position by the door, trying to stem the bleeding from his shoulder. Sarah, McKenna said quietly, go tend to his wound. Man's got a date with a hangman's rope, needs to be healthy for it. As Sarah moved to bind Reyes's shoulder, McKenna knelt beside Hawkins. 8 years studying strategy, he said almost conversationally. All that reading, all that planning, and you never learned the most important lesson of all, which is, Hawkins spat through pain-clenched teeth, some enemies you're better off leaving alone. McKenna's voice dropped to a whisper. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. Remember that in prison. For however long you managed to survive there, the sun had set completely now, leaving the mission in darkness broken only by shafts of moonlight. In one of these, father and daughter worked with practiced efficiency to secure their prisoners, their movements synchronized by years of training and trust. They'd come for revenge and found something they hadn't expected, proof that some legends don't fade with time, they just pass them down to the next generation. Dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of gold as Marshal Wilson's posse arrived at the old mission. They found James McKenna and his daughter sitting calmly on the front steps, sharing coffee from an old tin pot. 7 men were secured inside. 2 dead, 5 alive but wishing they weren't. Quite a mess you've got here, Wilson said, surveying the scene. His deputies moved carefully around father and daughter, noting their matching steady hands and vigilant eyes. Had some uninvited guests, McKenna replied mildly. Sarah helped me explain the problem with their manners. Wilson looked at the precise shooting, the methodical way each man had been disabled or eliminated. I count 7 men, James, all experienced. Gun hands. Sure you don't want to tell me how you managed that alone? Wasn't alone. McKenna nodded toward Sarah. Had the best backup in Texas. Sarah cleaned her borrowed revolver with practiced ease, her movements mirroring her father's. The deputies gave her the same respectful distance they gave him. Something had changed in the night, a truth revealed that couldn't be hidden again. Hawkins kept talking about strategy, she said, checking the cylinder. About studying warfare. Never understood it wasn't about the fighting at all, did he, Dad? No, baby, he didn't. McKenna watched his old friend Wilson directing the prisoners' transport. It's about making sure the fight ends before it begins, about being so prepared that victory is certain before the first shot. The rising sun caught the silver in McKenna's hair, the fresh lines around his eyes, but there was something else. There too, a peace that hadn't been present before, as if some long-held tension had finally released. "You know this changes things," Wilson said quietly. "Word's gonna spread. Deadeye McKenna's daughter, just as deadly as her father. Let it spread." McKenna's voice carried no concern. "Maybe save us trouble down the line. Some stories are better than bullets for keeping the peace." Sarah holstered her gun with fluid grace. "Besides, anyone who comes looking for the legend—" She smiled her father's smile. "They'll find two of us waiting." As the prisoners were loaded into wagons, Hawkins caught McKenna's eye one last time. "You've made her like you," he called out, bitter in defeat. "Turned her into a killer." "No," McKenna replied calmly. "I taught her to survive men like you. The rest," he looked at his daughter with quiet pride, "that's just who we are." Wilson's posse departed with their prisoners, leaving father and daughter alone in the morning light. Sarah picked up their coffee pot, pouring the last drops. "All those years of training," she said thoughtfully. "All those lessons about watching, waiting, being ready. You weren't just preparing me for them, were you? You were preparing yourself to trust me." McKenna was silent for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher over their Texas home. "Hardest thing I ever did was balance keeping you safe with letting you be strong, wanting to protect you while knowing you needed to protect yourself. And now, he smiled, a real smile this time, not the cold one his enemies knew. "Now I reckon we protect each other, way family should." They mounted up for the ride home, moving with the same fluid grace, the same quiet awareness of their surroundings. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The weight of secrets had lifted, replaced by the strength of shared understanding. "No," Sarah said as they rode. "Those men thought they were hunting a legend. And what did they find? Something better." She looked at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. They found the truth behind it. The Texas sun climbed higher, washing away the shadows of night, but some shadows had been banished more permanently. The legend of Deadeye McKenna hadn't ended. It had evolved, becoming something stronger, something shared between father and daughter. A legacy written not just in gunsmoke and courage, but in trust and understanding. And in the end, that was the deadliest combination of all. Sarah noticed something was off about Reyes as the sun began to set. While Hawkins paced and fumed, the Mexican gunman kept checking his pocket watch, his eyes darting to specific windows at regular intervals. "He's waiting for something," she realized. This wasn't just about revenge. "Getting nervous, Mr. Reyes?" she asked casually. "Seems like you're expecting company." Hawkins shot his partner a sharp look. "What's she talking about?" "Nothing," Reyes snapped too quickly. "Girls trying to get in our heads," but Sarah had seen the flash of panic in his eyes. 8 years in prison had changed more than just Hawkins. While Tom had studied strategy, Reyes had been building connections, making deals. "You know what I think?" Sarah kept her voice calm, even as she worked the ropes looser. "I think someone paid you to make sure my father would be here, tonight, at this specific place." "Shut up." Reyes's composure cracked slightly. "The Valdez cartel," she continued, watching his reaction. "They've been moving north, trying to establish routes through Texas. But Deadeye McKenna's reputation was keeping them cautious. They needed him. Distracted." Hawkins turned slowly to face his partner. "Victor, what's she talking about?" "Don't listen to her," Reyes said, but his hand had moved closer to his gun. "She's playing us against each other." "No!" Hawkins's voice was dangerous now. "She's revealing your game. 8 years I planned this revenge, and you turned it into a distraction for drug runners?" Sarah watched the partnership dissolve, remembering her father's words. Sometimes the best strategy is letting your enemies destroy themselves. The sound of distant horses made everyone freeze. Reyes checked his watch again, and Sarah saw the truth settle over Hawkins like a thundercloud. "You sold us out," he whispered. "Sold my revenge to the highest bidder." Outside, McKenna watched the same approaching riders through his rifle scope. 12 men, heavily armed, moving with military precision. The Valdez cartel's elite gunmen, right on schedule. "Well played, Sarah," he murmured, seeing how his daughter had exposed the hidden plan. "Now let's show them why some territories are best left unclaimed." McKenna watched the Valdez cartel riders approach through his scope, his mind already recalculating odds and angles. These weren't common gunmen. Their formation and weapons spoke of military training, probably former Mexican army turned mercenaries. "Trying to kill two birds with one stone," he muttered, understanding the play. The cartel would eliminate him, make the territory safe for their operations, and Reyes would get his cut. Meanwhile, Hawkins's revenge scheme had just been a convenient cover. Inside the mission, the situation was unraveling fast. "How much?" Hawkins grabbed Reyes by the shirt. "How much did they pay you to turn my revenge into their land grab?" "Enough to make 8 years in prison worth it," Reyes sneered, dropping his pretense. "While you were reading books about dead generals, I was building a future." Sarah watched the confrontation carefully, noting how the hired guns were shifting positions, choosing sides. 2 moved closer to Reyes, while one, the youngest, seemed more loyal to Hawkins. "You know what this means?" she said quietly. "When the cartel arrives, they can't leave any of you alive. Too many witnesses." The young gunman, barely 20, looked at her sharply. Sarah had read him right. He hadn't signed up for this level of betrayal. "She's lying," Reyes snapped. "Valdez rewards loyalty, like the 3 men they rewarded last month." Sarah kept her voice neutral. "The ones who helped them take Crystal River? Found in shallow graves once the territory was secured." Hawkins' gun came up, pointing at his former partner. "All these years, watching my back in prison, pretending to share my cause. You were just setting me up." Outside, McKenna had ghosted to a new position. The cartel riders had split into 3 groups, standard tactical approach, but their attention was focused on the mission's main entrance. They hadn't spotted him in the gathering dusk. He drew one of his Colts, checking the load. Time to remind them why some legends are best left alone. His first shot took the lead rider's horse from under him, creating chaos in the formation. His second dropped another gunman before they could identify his position. The remaining riders scattered for cover, their disciplined approach dissolving into confusion. Inside, the sound of gunfire heightened the tension. The young gunman had moved slightly away from Reyes, closer to Sarah. She could read the fear in his eyes. He was realizing just how deep he'd gotten into something he didn't understand. "Last chance, kid," she whispered. "When this starts, which side do you want to be on?" More shots rang out, followed by screams. McKenna was systematically eliminating the cartel's advantage in numbers, using their own tactical formation against them. Each group thought the others were being attacked, leading to friendly fire and confusion. "It's falling apart, Victor." Hawkins's voice was deadly calm. "Just like everything else you touch." "It's not over." Reyes backed toward the window. "Valdez doesn't fail. When his men get here..." A bullet smashed through the window between them, sending everyone diving for cover. In the chaos, Sarah felt the young gunman's knife slip into her hands as he dove past her. "Make it count," he whispered. Outside, McKenna had reduced the cartel's 12 men to 7, forcing them to bunch together for protection. Exactly where he wanted them. "Let's add some pressure," he smiled grimly, striking a match. The oil-soaked arrows he'd prepared, another old ranger trick, arced through the darkness, turning the cartel's cover into a death trap. Inside, Sarah's bonds fell away as Hawkins and Reyes faced each other, former partners now deadly enemies. The other hired Guns had chosen sides, creating a Mexican standoff that could explode any second. "Dad's coming," she announced calmly, revealing her freed hands. "And he's bringing hell with him. Last chance for anyone who wants to survive the night. Choose your side carefully." The young gunman stepped closer to her, gun drawn, but pointed, at Reyes. Outside, the night erupted in gunfire and flames as McKenna's trap closed on the cartel riders. The mission erupted into chaos as Sarah moved. Her first action wasn't to attack, but to knock over the oil lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Just as her father had taught her, control the light, control the fight. Outside, McKenna saw the lamp fall through his scope and smiled. His daughter was right on schedule. "Time to close the trap," he whispered, setting off the charges he'd planted earlier. The explosions weren't meant to kill, just to drive the remaining cartel gunmen exactly where he wanted them. Inside, Sarah and the young gunman had taken position behind an overturned table. Reyes and his 2 loyal men were pinned near the windows, while Hawkins had scrambled behind a stone pillar. "You really think you can shoot your way out of this?" Reyes shouted. "Valdez has 30 more men coming." "No," Sarah replied calmly. "He doesn't. Because my father didn't just spend the last hour hunting. He spent it sending messages. Right about now, the Rangers are hitting Valdez's staging area at the old Cooper Ranch." She saw doubt flicker across Reyes's face. He knew enough about McKenna to wonder if she was bluffing. Outside, another explosion lit up the night. McKenna had channeled the remaining cartel riders into a box canyon, standard cavalry tactics, but with a twist. The canyon walls were rigged with oil-soaked brush. One shot, and their cover would become an inferno. "Last chance," he called out. "Drop your guns, walk away. Only warning you get." The cartel riders responded with a volley of gunfire. McKenna shook his head. "Some folks just have to learn the hard way." His rifle cracked once, hitting the brush high on the canyon wall. Fire raced down both sides, trapping the riders in a corridor of flame. Inside the mission, the sound of screaming. Horses and panicked Spanish cursing told its own story. Reyes felt his plan crumbling. "You see," Sarah said softly, "while you were betraying your partner, while you were setting up your clever ambush, my father and I were having a conversation without words. Every move, every decision, perfectly coordinated." As if to prove her. "Point!" McKenna's voice rang out from directly behind Reyes's position. "Now, baby girl!" Sarah and the young gunman opened fire simultaneously, driving Reyes and his men away from the windows, straight into McKenna's line of sight. Too precise. Shots dropped Reyes's supporters before they could turn. Hawkins, seeing his chance, tried to shoot Reyes from behind. But Sarah had anticipated this, her bullet catching him in the gun hand before he could fire. "That's not how this ends," she said firmly. "You both face justice." Outside, the trapped cartel riders had surrendered, their bravado broken by McKenna's methodical dismantling of their forces. The night was lit by burning brush and scattered gunfire as the last pockets of resistance collapsed. "Clear outside," McKenna called, stepping into view. His guns covered both Reyes and Hawkins as Sarah and the young gunman kept their positions. "You know," he said conversationally, "I spent 5 years trying to leave the violence behind. Trying to be just another rancher, but you had to push." His voice hardened. "Had to come after my daughter." "It was just business," Reyes tried, his hands raised. "Valdez paid." "Don't much care about your reasons," McKenna cut him off. "Care about the choice you made, the line you crossed." Sarah moved to stand beside her father, their guns aligned with practiced precision. In that moment, everyone in the room understood. This wasn't just about revenge or justice or even survival. This was about family, about a father and daughter who had turned preparation into perfection, training into unstoppable teamwork. "Marshal Wilson will be here soon," Sarah said calmly. "Try anything before then. You won't have to worry about prison." The young gunman kept his weapon trained on the prisoners while Sarah and her father secured them. Their movements were synchronized, efficient, each anticipating the other's needs without a word. Outside, the last echoes of gunfire faded into the Texas night. The mission's walls were scarred by bullets and smoke, but still standing. Much like the McKennas themselves, they had faced their trial by fire and emerged stronger, not just as survivors, but as partners in a legacy that would be whispered about in saloons from El Paso to Amarillo. The night when everyone learned that Deadeye, McKenna's greatest achievement, wasn't his own legend. It was the daughter he'd trained to surpass it. Dawn broke over a changed landscape. Marshal Wilson's posse found 19 men in total, 7 dead, 12 alive but wishing otherwise. The mission's grounds told a story that would become legend. Precise shot placement, tactical positioning, the work of not one master gunfighter, but 2. "Never seen anything like it," Wilson muttered, surveying the scene. "Valdez's best men, Hawkins's crew, all taken down with military precision." He turned to McKenna. "You didn't just win a gunfight, you conducted an operation." McKenna stood, with Sarah by their horses, both cleaning their weapons with identical methodical care. "I had good help," he said simply. The young gunman who'd helped Sarah, now identifying himself as Billy Carter, was giving his statement to the deputies. "They moved like ghosts," he said, shaking his head, "like they could read each other's minds. Never seen anything so perfectly coordinated." Reyes and Hawkins sat bound in the prison wagon, their former partnership destroyed along with their ambitions. Their faces showed the dawning realization that they hadn't just failed. They'd created something far more dangerous than what they'd sought to destroy. "You know what this means," Wilson said privately to McKenna. "Word's going to spread. Every gunslinger and outlaw from here to Mexico will know that Deadeye McKenna's not just a legend anymore. He's a legacy." Sarah finished cleaning her borrowed revolver, her movements precise and practiced. "They'll think twice now," she said calmly, "knowing it's not just Dad they have to worry about." The surviving cartel riders were secured separately, their military discipline broken. One of them, his arm bandaged where Sarah's shot had taken him down, couldn't stop staring at father and daughter. "El fantasma y su hija," he whispered. The ghost and his daughter. McKenna heard the new legend being born and felt an unexpected pride. He'd spent years trying to protect Sarah from his violent past, only to discover he'd prepared her to become something even more formidable, a partner worthy of his legacy. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly as they mounted up, "not of the killing, but of how you protected what matters, how you kept your head when everything went to hell." "Had a good teacher," Sarah replied, adjusting her saddle. Then, with a slight smile, "Though I think some things just run in the blood." Wilson approached with one last question. "What about Valdez? He won't take this lying down." "No," McKenna agreed, "he won't. But now he knows what's waiting if he tries again." He looked at his daughter with quiet pride. "Some territories just aren't worth the cost of taking." They rode out as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind a story that would grow with each telling. The tale of how the deadliest gunfighter in Texas hadn't just trained his daughter to survive, he'd trained her to excel, to carry forward a legacy that would keep the peace more surely than any law. But more importantly, they rode out changed. The secrets and shadows that had stood between them were gone, replaced by an understanding deeper than blood. They were more than father and daughter now. They were partners in a legend that was just beginning. A month after the mission fight, Sarah sat on the McKenna ranch porch, cleaning her new revolvers, a matched pair like her father's, ordered specially from back east. The morning paper lay beside her, its headline telling its own story. Valdez. Cartel withdraws from Texas, territories deemed too costly to hold. "Making quite a name for yourself," Marshal Wilson said, riding up to the porch. He'd been busy these past weeks, dealing with the aftermath of what folks were now calling the Mission Night. Word travels, Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. Like her father, she'd developed the habit of maintaining her weapons while holding conversation. Though I hear they're telling it wrong in most places. Oh? Wilson dismounted, accepting the coffee she offered. Which version you heard? My favorite's the one where Dad and I are actually identical twins, separated at birth. She smiled slightly, though I prefer the one about us being spirits of vengeance, unable to die. People need their stories, McKenna said, emerging from the barn. Keeps them believing in something bigger than themselves. Wilson nodded seriously. Stories are keeping the peace better than any law right now. 3 different gangs turned around at the territory border last week. Just rode away when they heard this was McKenna land. And Valdez? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Running scared. After what you two did to his elite crew. Wilson shook his head in admiration. Man's pulling back to Mexico, claiming Texas is cursed ground. McKenna sat beside his daughter, his own guns cleaned and ready. Curse of family, he said quietly, more powerful than any ghost story. That's not all, Wilson continued. Every rancher and farmer in 3 counties is asking about Sarah, wanting to know if she'll teach their daughters to shoot, to defend themselves. Sarah's hands paused in their work. That's not a bad idea, she said thoughtfully. Mom always said the best way to keep peace is to make sure everyone knows how to maintain it. Like father, like daughter, Wilson smiled, though I never thought I'd see the day when Deadeye McKenna's legacy would be teaching young ladies to shoot. Times change, McKenna replied. Maybe it's time the legend did too. Sarah's got her own way of doing things. Might be better than the old ways. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Sarah and her father shifted position slightly, unconsciously covering different angles. But it was just young Billy Carter, now working as a deputy under Wilson. Marshal, he called out, reining in. Got word from up north. Coleman gang was asking questions about moving into the territory. He grinned. Right up until they heard about the Mission Night, cleared out so fast they left their breakfast cooking. Wilson laughed. Reputation's better than rifles sometimes. Speaking of which, he turned to Sarah. Got a proposition for you both. State's looking for special deputies, people who can handle the kind of trouble normal law can't touch. Not interested, McKenna said automatically, but Sarah raised her hand. Let him finish, Dad. World's changing. Maybe we should change with it. McKenna studied his daughter, seeing not just the skilled gunfighter she'd become, but the leader she was becoming. Your mother used to say the same thing, about adapting, about finding new ways to use old skills. Special deputies, Wilson continued, with the authority to cross county lines, handle the bigger threats, but more importantly, to train others. Build something that lasts longer than legends. Sarah holstered her cleaned revolvers with fluid grace. Might be nice, she said thoughtfully, teaching people to protect themselves instead of just doing the protecting. McKenna was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your mother would have liked that. Using what we know to build something better. As if to emphasize the point, another rider appeared, this one a young woman from a neighboring ranch, come for the shooting lessons Sarah had started offering. Times really are changing, Wilson observed, watching Sarah move to greet her student, Deadeye McKenna, and his daughter, building a legacy of peace instead of violence. No, McKenna corrected, watching with pride as Sarah demonstrated proper stance to her eager student. Building something better than a legacy. Building a future. The Texas sun climbed higher, shining down on a territory that had learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes the strongest legends aren't built on fear, but on family. on the power of one generation teaching the next, not just how to survive, but how to thrive. And in the end, that was a story worth telling. 6 months after the mission night, the McKenna ranch had changed. The barn now housed a shooting range where twice a week Sarah taught classes to women from across 3 counties. The old storage shed had been converted into a tactical training room where McKenna shared decades of hard-won wisdom with selected deputies. But some things remained the same. Father and daughter still practiced at dawn, their matched revolvers turning tin cans to dust with mechanical precision. They still scanned horizons, checked approaches, maintained the habits that had kept them alive. "Got another letter from Valdez," Sarah said one morning, reading the mail. "Third one this month." McKenna raised an eyebrow. "Still trying to buy. Peace? Offering business opportunities now." She smiled her father's smile. "Says he'd rather have us as allies than enemies." Smart man. McKenna watched his newest class of deputies practicing. Finally learned what those others didn't. Some legends are better left as friends. The young woman Sarah had been training approached, her shooting now almost as precise as her teachers. "Miss McKenna, there's talk of trouble down in Laredo, some new gang thinking about moving north." "Let them think about it," Sarah replied calmly. "Sometimes the idea of what's waiting is enough to change minds." As if to prove her point, a rider appeared on the road, another message from another would-be conqueror, another power learning the new reality of Texas. The territory had changed. The legend of Deadeye McKenna hadn't ended. It had evolved into something more powerful. "You know what all those books Hawkins read got wrong?" McKenna asked, watching the rider approach. "They taught him about strategy, about warfare, but they never taught him about legacy." Sarah nodded, understanding, "about how some things pass from father to daughter, some things that can't be learned from books." The rider delivered his message. Another gang seeking permission to pass through McKenna territory. Another potential threat, choosing wisdom over violence. "Your mother would be proud," McKenna said softly. "Not of the guns or the fighting, but of how you've taken what I taught you and made it into something better." "We both did," Sarah corrected. "Changed the legend from one about fear to one about protection, about family." As the sun set over Texas, father and daughter stood watching their students practice. The shooting range rang with controlled fire, each shot a reminder that the territory was safer now than it had ever been, not because of violence or threat, but because of something more powerful. The day 2 legends had become one, when a father's desperate rescue had transformed into a daughter's ascension. Some stories end with gunfire and glory, but the best ones, the ones that last, end with something stronger. They end with legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.